The Boy Who Carried the Stars. Chapter 1. Where the Cobblestones Whisper. Long, long ago, before motorcar roads cut through the hills, before electric lamps chased away the dark, and before anyone had ever dreamed of a machine that could fly, there was a small town tucked between two great rolling hills in the English countryside. It was called Millhaven, and it was the sort of place that seemed to have been there forever. The streets of Millhaven were paved with round gray cobblestones worn smooth by centuries of feet, the boots of farmers, the hooves of horses, the bare soles of children chasing each other down the sloping lanes. The houses were built of pale limestone and dark oak timber, their rooftops thick with moss the color of emeralds, their chimneys forever releasing lazy curls of smoke that drifted up to meet the clouds. In the mornings, when mist rolled in from the river Ash, the whole town looked as though it had been painted by a dreaming hand, and not quite finished. The market square sat at the very heart of Millhaven. It was a wide, cobblestone space surrounded by the shops of tradespeople. A baker whose loaves could be smelled from the top of the hill at sunrise. A blacksmith whose hammer rang like a church bell all day long. A cloth merchant who hung bolts of colored fabric from her window like a row of flags. And at the very center of the square, standing taller and prouder than all the others, the workshop of Master Aldrich the candlemaker. Every town in England in those days needed a candlemaker. This was the year 1347, and candles were everything. They lit the great stone church where the townspeople prayed. They burned through the night in the windows of sick rooms. They guided travelers on dark roads. They sat on the tables of rich lords and poor farmers alike. Without candles, the world after sunset was simply black, a darkness so complete that most people stayed locked indoors from dusk until dawn. Master Aldrich made the finest candles in all of Millhaven, and perhaps in all the county. He was a short, round man with a red face and a gray beard so thick it looked like a bird might have nested in it. He wore the same brown leather apron every single day, stained with tallow and beeswax, and he smelled permanently of warm honey and wood smoke. He spoke in short sentences, rarely smiled, and was known to be extremely particular about three things: the quality of his wax, the straightness of his wicks, and the punctuality of his apprentice. His apprentice was a boy named Thomas. Chapter 2. Thomas of the Tanner's Lane. Thomas Whitfield was 10 years old, small for his age, and possessed of the kind of bright brown eyes that seemed always to be watching something no one else had noticed. He had a mop of dark hair that refused to lie flat, no matter how much he dampened it, a gap between his two front teeth that whistled when he spoke too fast, and hands that were already calloused from months of work in the candlemaker's shop. He lived on Tanner's Lane, the poorest street in Millhaven, in a 2-room cottage with his mother, his grandmother, and his younger sister Nell, who was 7 and clever in ways that often embarrassed people twice her age. Their father had been a soldier who marched away with the king's army 3 years past and had not returned. Their mother, Agnes, took in laundry and mending to keep them fed. It was not a life of comfort, but it was a life full of warmth. The cottage always smelled of bread and soap and the dried herbs that Grandmother Maud hung from the ceiling rafters. Thomas had been apprenticed to Master Aldrich for 6 months. It had come about because Grandmother Maud knew the candlemaker's older sister, who had put in a good word. The pay was not much, a halfpenny a week, but there was also a small meal provided at midday, And sometimes Master Aldrich allowed Thomas to carry home the short stub ends of candles that were too small to sell. These were precious. On winter nights, those small stubs of light made all the difference between a dark, frightening room and a warm, cheerful one. Every morning, Thomas rose before the sun. He washed his face in the cold water basin, ate the crust of bread his mother left out for him, pulled on his rough linen shirt and his patched wool trousers, and walked the 12 minutes from Tanner's Lane to the market square. He arrived at Master Aldrich's workshop exactly as the church bell struck 6, unbarred the heavy door, swept the floor, lit the fire beneath the great copper melting pot, and began the day's work. The work of a candlemaker's apprentice was many things. It was hot and slow and required enormous patience. Thomas had to dip wicks into the vats of melted tallow, the fat rendered from sheep and cattle, over and over again, dozens of times, building up the candle layer by patient layer. The tallow candles were the common ones, bought by ordinary townspeople, but the beeswax candles were different. White and sweet-smelling, they were made for the church and for the Lord of Millhaven, a man called Sir Edmund Blackwood, who lived in the grey stone manor house on the eastern hill. Beeswax was expensive, and Master Aldrich handled it himself, allowing Thomas only to watch. The boy did not mind. He liked watching. He liked learning. He liked the way the candlemaker muttered to himself as he worked, saying things like, "Even heat. Aldrich, even heat. A candle made in anger burns crooked. Or the wick must find the center, or the flame will devour one side and leave the other cold." Thomas kept these sayings in his head like small treasures. He wrote them down at night on the edge of a scrap of parchment, using a piece of charcoal from the fire. He could read and write. His grandmother had taught him both, despite the fact that many children in Millhaven could do neither, and he had a feeling, though he could not have explained it, that knowing things was the only kind of treasure no one could take away from you. He did not yet know how important that feeling would turn out to be. Chapter 3. The Coming of the Plague Cloud. It was on an ordinary Tuesday in October that Thomas first heard the word that would change everything. He was sweeping the workshop floor, a task he did 3 times a day because tallow shavings and drips of wax accumulated endlessly, when 2 men stopped outside the open door to talk. Thomas swept slowly, listening without turning his head. "Arrived in Bristol last week," said the first man, a farmer Thomas recognized as Old Henry, who grew barley on the north side of the hill. "Killed half the sailors on one ship before they even made port. They're calling it the Black Death. God's punishment," said the second man, who was the miller. His voice was low with fear. "Started in France, they say. Before that, the East. Kills a man in 3 days. Black marks appear on the skin. The tongue swells. Henry," said Old Henry quietly, "it will reach England. Mark me. It will reach England before spring." They moved on. Thomas held his broom very still for a moment. He was 10 years old, and he had heard of plague before, the kind that carried off livestock, or that sickened a village and moved on. But something in those men's voices was different from the way adults normally talked about ordinary troubles. This was the sound of genuine, bone-deep terror. He had heard that sound once before, when they had received word that his father's regiment had been in a battle near the Scottish border. It was the sound of people who understood that the world was about to change in ways they could not stop. He said nothing to Master Aldrich. What would he say? He swept the floor and dipped the wicks and tended the fire and tried not to think about it. But that night in the cottage on Tanner's Lane, his grandmother told them. Grandmother Maud was a small, sharp-boned woman who had lived through more sorrows than she cared to count. She had seen the great famine 20 years past, when the rains failed and the grain rotted in the fields. She had buried 2 of her own children before they reached adulthood. She did not frighten easily, and she did not speak of frightening things unless they were real. She sat them all down around the small fire, Agnes, Thomas, and little Nell, and she told them what she had heard. "There is a sickness coming," she said, "a great sickness from the east. They say it is unlike anything seen in living memory. It travels fast. It does not care whether you are rich or poor, young or old." She looked at each of them in turn, her eyes bright and steady as candle flames. "I do not say this to make you afraid. I say it because afraid and prepared are two different things. Afraid makes you run in circles. Prepared makes you act. What do we do?" Agnes asked. "We keep the cottage clean. We stay away from sick people. We pray." Grandmother Maud folded her hands. "And we keep our candles lit. Light keeps the darkness from settling into the spirit." Nell, who had been sitting very quiet, said, "Thomas makes candles." "Yes," said Grandmother Maud, "and perhaps that will matter more than we know." Thomas looked at his calloused hands in the firelight. He had never thought of candle making as particularly important work. It was just the thing he did, the way other boys mucked out stables or carried grain. But now, for the first time, he began to understand that the small light he helped create every day pushed back against something real. Chapter 4. The Box That Must Not Be Opened. November arrived with cold winds and early frosts, and the plague remained, for now, far away. In Bristol, in London, in places that felt as distant as the moon. Life in Millhaven continued, which is what life mostly does. It continues, even when the world seems to be leaning dangerously. Master Aldrich received an unusual commission in the second week of November. A messenger in the livery of Lord Edmund Blackwood arrived at the workshop one morning, carrying a sealed letter. Thomas stood in the corner and pretended to organize the wick-winding frame while Master Aldrich read the letter, his lips moving slightly, his eyebrows climbing steadily upward toward the top of his bald head. "Well," said Master Aldrich at last, folding the letter carefully. "Well, well." He sat down on his stool, which creaked under his weight, and stared at the letter for a long moment. Then he remembered Thomas was there. "Boy, go and fetch water from the well. Take your time about it." Thomas fetched water from the well, taking a great deal of time about it, as instructed. By the time he returned, Master Aldrich had put the letter away somewhere, and his expression had returned to its usual look of concentrated concentration. But something had changed. Thomas, who was good at noticing things, noticed that the candlemaker's hands were not quite steady, and that he checked the locked wooden box on the top shelf, the one Thomas had never been told about, not once but 3 times before midday. The box was about the size of a large loaf of bread. It was made of dark walnut wood, smooth with age, with a brass clasp and a lock shaped like a coiled snake. Thomas had asked about it exactly once, back in his first week, and Master Aldrich had said only, "That is not your concern," in a tone that closed the topic as firmly as a door being shut and bolted. But now, 3 times in the morning, the candlemaker's eyes went to that box. It held something important. Thomas was certain of it. That afternoon, while Master Aldrich went to the back room to take his midday rest, he slept for exactly 30 minutes every day after eating, a habit he called essential maintenance. Thomas stood in the workshop and studied the shelf. He was not going to open the box. He was not even going to try. But he could observe. He could think. Beside the box, he noticed something new, a small linen parcel tied with green ribbon, which had not been there yesterday. From it came a faint but unmistakable scent, something sweet and unusual, different from the beeswax smell of the workshop. Thomas leaned closer, careful not to touch. It smelled like flowers he had never smelled before, something warm and exotic, like spices from far away. He stepped back exactly as he heard the creak of Master Aldrich's chair from the back room, and by the time the candlemaker reappeared rubbing his eyes, Thomas was industriously dipping wicks in the tallow vat and looking as innocent as the morning. Chapter 5. The Appointment. 3 days later, on a Friday evening, Thomas was about to leave for home when Master Aldrich stopped him. Thomas, the candlemaker's voice was unusually serious, more serious than even his normal serious, which was already quite serious. I am going to trust you with something. Thomas put down his coat and stood up straight. On Sunday next, Master Aldrich said, I must deliver a special order to the manor house. Lord Blackwood has commissioned something extraordinary, a set of candles unlike anything I have made before. The wax is imported from the East and has been stored in that parcel on the shelf for safekeeping. It must not be touched, must not be disturbed, must not be breathed upon by anyone who is not me. He fixed Thomas with a look that was somehow both fierce and worried at the same time. Do you understand? Yes, sir, said Thomas. These candles, Master Aldrich continued, lowering his voice even though they were alone in the shop and the door was bolted, are the most valuable things I have ever made. They are for the church, for the great ceremony at Advent. Lord Blackwood intends them to burn at the altar of St. Mary's for the entirety of the Christmas season. They are, he hesitated, then said the word carefully, as though it were fragile, sacred. Thomas nodded solemnly. You will accompany me to the manor on Sunday as my assistant. You will carry the wooden case. You will speak when spoken to, and not otherwise. And you will tell no one. No one. Thomas, are you listening? That we carry them or what they contain. Not your mother, not your sister, not your little friends in the lane. I don't have many friends, Thomas said honestly. Master Aldrich blinked. Good, then the secret will keep. He cleared his throat. Be here at 8:30 on Sunday morning. Washed and presentable. Thomas walked home feeling important and slightly frightened, which were, he was beginning to discover, two feelings that went together more often than not. Chapter 6. The eve of Sunday. Saturday passed in a state of barely contained excitement. Thomas helped his mother carry laundry to the river and back, helped Nell practice her reading with a dog-eared book Grandmother Maud had owned for 40 years, and lay awake that night for a long time, listening to the wind scrape the branches of the elm tree against the cottage wall and thinking about the manor house. He had never been inside the manor. He had seen it many times, everyone had, from the market square or from the road that curved around the base of the eastern hill. It was a large, gray stone building with narrow windows and a pair of great oak doors banded with iron. It had been built 300 years ago, people said, when the Norman conquerors were still fresh in England, still building their cold stone halls everywhere to remind the English who was in charge. Whether or not that was true, the manor always looked to Thomas like a building that was keeping a secret, the kind of building that, if it could talk, would tell you that it had seen things you wouldn't believe. He also thought, in the half-darkness before sleep, about the special wax, the foreign wax with the flower smell. He had learned enough candle-making to know that wax could be combined with other things, with herbs or resins, to give candles unusual properties. Some candles were made to smell pleasant. Some were made to repel insects. The very expensive ones had frankincense in them, which the priest used in the church on holy days. But this wax smelled like nothing Thomas had encountered in 6 months at the workshop. It seemed, somehow, more alive than ordinary wax. He wondered where it had come from. He fell asleep wondering, and in his dreams he walked through a darkness lit by a single golden candle that floated ahead of him, just out of reach. no matter how fast he walked toward it. Chapter 7. Lord Blackwood's House. Sunday morning. Cold, clear, the sky an almost painful blue above the frost-white rooftops. Thomas arrived at the workshop at 8:30 exactly, wearing his best shirt, the one his mother had mended 6 times, but still looked respectable if you didn't look too closely, and found Master Aldrich already waiting. The candle maker had assembled the special candles in a flat wooden case lined with soft wool. There were 12 of them, each about 2 feet long, their surfaces smooth as polished ivory, their color a deep, warm gold, not the pale yellow of ordinary beeswax, but a color that seemed to hold the light inside itself, even in the cold morning shadows of the workshop. Each one had been wound with a wick of remarkable fineness, twisted from threads so smooth Thomas had never seen their like. "Don't stare at them," said Master Aldrich, though he himself was gazing at them with obvious pride. "And don't drop the case." "I won't stare and I won't drop it," said Thomas, which turned out to be harder than he expected, because the candles were extraordinary. Even in the ordinary morning light, they seemed to glow, as if something inside them were gently, patiently, trying to wake up. They walked through the market square, which was mostly empty at this hour on a Sunday, with only a few early risers hurrying to church. They walked up the long road that wound to the eastern hill. The manor house loomed above them, its stone walls catching the pale winter sunlight. Thomas carried the case in both arms and did not drop it once, though his arms began to ache badly before they were halfway up the hill. The great iron-banded doors were opened by a manservant in brown livery, who seemed to be expecting them. He led them through a wide entrance hall, stone-floored, hung with tapestries showing hunting scenes, smelling of cold stone and wood smoke, and into a smaller room off the main corridor, where a fire burned in the hearth and Lord Edmund Blackwood himself stood waiting. Thomas had seen Lord Blackwood before, from a distance, when the Lord came to the market. He was a tall man, perhaps 50 years old, with a narrow face and deep-set eyes of a dark gray that matched the stone of his manner. He wore a long, fur-lined robe and stood very straight, with the particular stillness of a person accustomed to other people coming to him rather than the reverse. "Aldrich," he said, "you have them." "My lord." Master Aldrich gave a short bow. He gestured to Thomas. "My apprentice will open the case." Thomas set the case on the table indicated, unlatched the clasp carefully, and folded back the wool wrapping to reveal the golden candles. Lord Blackwood stepped forward and studied them for a long, silent moment. Then something unusual happened. The Lord's severe expression softened, not entirely but genuinely, and he said, almost to himself, "Remarkable." "They are as fine as I can make them," said Master Aldrich with what Thomas recognized as rare satisfaction. Lord Blackwood reached out and almost touched one of the candles, then drew his hand back. "The wax came at great cost and great distance," he said, "from a monastery in the Italian mountains, where the monks have maintained a tradition of candle-making stretching back 500 years. These are not merely decorative, Aldrich. These are," he paused, as if choosing his next word carefully, "significant." Master Aldrich nodded. "I treated them accordingly, my lord." They discussed delivery times and payment, and Thomas stood quietly in the corner near the door, looking at nothing in particular the way his grandmother had taught him to look at nothing in particular when he was actually trying to listen very carefully to everything. It was in this way that he heard the noise. Chapter 8. Behind the arras. It came from behind a large tapestry on the wall to Thomas's left, a heavy, dark-colored hanging depicting a forest scene with a stag at bay. It was the softest sound imaginable, the tiniest crake, like a floor settling or a boot shifting its weight. Thomas did not react. He kept his face still and his eyes forward and moved only his ears, the way his grandmother had once told him a rabbit listens, by going very, very quiet and letting the sound come to it. A few seconds later, the sound came again, a breath. Someone was standing behind the tapestry, listening. Lord Blackwood and Master Aldrich continued to talk, their backs to the tapestry. Thomas weighed his options quickly. He was 10 years old and a candlemaker's apprentice, which gave him no authority to speak up about suspicious sounds in a lord's house. If he said something and it turned out to be a cat or a servant tidying a back room, he would be embarrassed. If he said something and it turned out to be something more serious, he would have done the right thing. But if he said nothing and it turned out to be something serious, he did the third thing. He watched and waited and stored up what he knew. The tapestry did not move again. Chapter 9. What Thomas found on the hill. On the walk back down the hill, carrying the empty case, Thomas told Master Aldrich what he had heard. The candlemaker stopped walking. He turned and looked at Thomas with an expression the boy couldn't quite read. "You are certain?" "Two sounds," Thomas said, "like a person shifting their weight. Both times from behind the big tapestry, the dark one on the left wall." Master Aldrich was quiet for a long moment. He looked back up the hill at the manor house. Then he looked at Thomas with an expression that was, perhaps for the first time ever, fully honest, stripped of the usual professional reserve. "Listen to me carefully," he said. "Tell no one what you heard. Not your mother, not your grandmother, nobody. Can you do that?" "Yes," said Thomas. "But, sir—" "I mean it, Thomas. This is not adventure-seeking. This is not a game. What you may have stumbled into is something dangerous for all of Millhaven, and I need you to behave as if you heard nothing unusual. Go home. Eat your Sunday dinner. Be a boy." He looked at Thomas very steadily. "Will you do that?" "Yes," Thomas said. Then, after a pause, "What is dangerous about it, sir?" Master Aldrich pressed his lips together. Then, with the air of a man deciding something difficult, he said 3 words. "The candles, Thomas." And then he walked on and did not say another word all the way to the market square. Chapter 10. The missing case. Thomas did go home. He did eat his Sunday dinner, a thin soup with a piece of salted pork, which was a Sunday luxury. He did try to be a boy as instructed. He fed the chickens in the little pen behind the cottage and helped Nell put away her reading book and listened to Grandmother Maud tell the story she always told on Sunday evenings about the time she had danced at a fair as a young girl and dropped her shoe in the river and the fisherman's son had dived in to get it back. But he could not stop thinking. The candles were significant. Lord Blackwood had used exactly that word. Someone had been hiding behind the tapestry, listening. And Master Aldrich, who had never looked frightened of anything in all the time Thomas had known him, had looked frightened. On Monday morning, Thomas arrived at the workshop at 6 o'clock as usual and found the door already ajar. Not open, ajar. By about 3 inches. Master Aldrich never left the door ajar. Master Aldrich bolted the door every night with the thoroughness of a man who had once been burgled and had not forgotten the experience. Thomas stood on the step and pushed the door with one finger, and it swung inward on its well-oiled hinges. He stepped inside. The workshop was in disarray. The wick-winding frames had been knocked from the table. The jars of tallow were toppled, their lids off, their contents dripping in slow, cold rivers across the worktop. The storage boxes had been opened and rummaged through, and the shelf, the high shelf where the walnut box with the snake clasp had sat for 6 months, was empty. The box was gone. Thomas stood very still for a long moment. His mind, trained by 6 months of patient candle-making, worked through the information methodically. The candlemaker had discovered the disorder himself and gone for help, or the candlemaker was here somewhere. He looked around more carefully. Master Aldrich was sitting in the back room, on the floor, leaning against the wall. He was conscious and had a bruise the size of a hen's egg rising purple and red on the side of his forehead. He looked up when Thomas came in. "Ah," he said, "you're here." "I'm here," said Thomas. "Are you hurt?" "Considerably," said Master Aldrich. "Fetch the physician from the top of the lane, and then," he grimaced, pressing a hand to his head, "fetch Lord Blackwood. Tell his man it is urgent. Tell him the box is gone." Thomas ran. Chapter 11. The Physician and the Lord. The physician, a thin, precise man called Dr. Reeve, arrived first. He examined Master Aldrich's head, pronounced nothing was broken, applied a cold cloth, and told the candlemaker to stay seated. Then he turned to Thomas. "Who struck him?" "I don't know," Thomas said honestly. "I found him like this." "When did it happen?" "Sometime in the night, sir. The door was open when I arrived." Dr. Reeve pressed his lips together and looked at the disorder of the workshop. "Thieves," he said flatly. "Yes, sir," said Thomas. "I've already sent for Lord Blackwood." The Lord arrived 20 minutes later, his riding cloak still on, his dark gray eyes moving rapidly around the room in a way that told Thomas he had been thinking very fast indeed on the ride down from the manor. He crouched beside Master Aldrich, listened to the candlemaker's account, asked 3 short questions, and then stood up and looked at Thomas. "You," he said, "you were the boy at the manor yesterday." "Yes, my lord." "Did you see anyone at all, in the street this morning, on your way here?" Thomas thought carefully. The discipline of candle-making, of moving slowly, attending to one thing at a time, served him well in that moment. He retraced his steps in his mind, down Tanner's Lane, across the bridge over the mill stream, past the bakery. "The bakery, my lord," he said slowly. "There were 2 men by the side of the bakery. They were there when I passed, but they weren't waiting for bread. The bakery wasn't open yet. They were watching the road. One of them had mud on his boots, fresh mud like from the riverbank. He was carrying something under his arm." Lord Blackwood's eyes sharpened. "What was he carrying?" Thomas looked at the empty shelf. "A box, my lord, about this size." He held his hands apart to indicate the size of the walnut box. Chapter 12. The Race to the River. Lord Blackwood sent a manservant to rouse the town constable and headed for the door. Then he paused and turned back to Thomas. "Boy, you said the man had river mud on his boots." "Yes, my lord." "Then they're planning to leave by the river. There is a boat landing at the south bend of the River Ash. Smugglers have used it for years." He said this last part with the flat calm of a man stating a fact rather than an accusation. "If they reach that landing before we do, they can be miles downriver before nightfall. And the candles," he stopped. "Those candles cannot leave Millhaven. Do you understand?" Thomas did not entirely understand, but he understood well enough. "Yes, my lord." "Can you run fast?" Thomas thought of all the mornings he had run across town to open the workshop before the church bell struck 6. "Fairly fast, my lord." "Then run. The south landing is at the bottom of Millhaven Lane, past the old mill. Get there before they do, and make enough noise to draw attention. Can you manage that?" "Yes, my lord." "I will follow with the constable. Go." Now, Thomas went. He ran like the wind. Chapter 13. Millhaven Lane. He had never run so fast in his life. Past the market square. Deserted at this hour, the empty stalls looking strange and spectral in the morning cold. Down the short cut through the tanner's yard. He knew every shortcut in Millhaven, which turned out to be extremely useful. Along the back of the church, and out onto Millhaven Lane, which was a long, straight road running downhill to the river. He could see the river already, a silver-gray ribbon, through the bare winter trees at the bottom of the lane. He could also see, far ahead of him, two figures moving quickly toward it. They were perhaps 300 yards ahead. One of them was tall and broad-shouldered. The other was shorter and carried something under his arm that caught the pale morning light with a dull walnut gleam. Thomas ran harder. He was gaining on them. His legs were young, and he knew the road, and they were slowed by whatever was in the box. He didn't know yet what he was going to do when he caught them, only that he had to delay them, had to make noise, had to, as Lord Blackwood had said, do something. The taller man glanced back over his shoulder. He saw Thomas and said something to his companion. They broke into a run. Thomas ran faster. His lungs ached. His legs burned. The gap between them was closing. No, widening again. The taller man was very fast. And then, Thomas did something that saved the situation completely by accident. He tripped. He hit a loose cobblestone at the edge of the lane where it curved near the old mill, and went sprawling headlong into a wooden pile of stacked timber outside the mill's fence, which collapsed with an enormous crash that echoed off every building on the lane. The sound was extraordinary. A thunderous crack and clatter that sent birds exploding from the trees, that made two horses in a nearby field rear back in alarm, and that drew 3 mill workers running out of the mill to see what in heaven's name had just happened. Thomas lay in the scattered timber, winded, his palms scraped, and heard one of the mill workers shout, "Oi, you, stop there," not at Thomas, but at the 2 men ahead, who had been startled by the noise into hesitating, which was all the time needed, because down the lane from the direction of the market square came the sound of hoofbeats. 2 horses moving fast. Lord Blackwood and the town constable, a stout and surprisingly quick man called Constable Warren. Chapter 14. By the River. The 2 thieves tried to run for the landing, but the horses outpaced them easily. Constable Warren dismounted with a practiced agility that surprised Thomas entirely, and the taller thief, who turned out to be a hired man from a town 20 miles away, paid to carry and deliver, went down in a matter of seconds. The shorter man dropped the walnut box in his panic, and it landed hard on the frozen ground, the clasp popping open and the lid flying back. Thomas, who had picked himself up from the timber pile and limped the last 50 yards to the riverside, arrived just in time to see the interior of the box fully for the first time. It did not contain completed candles. There were no candles in it at all. What it contained were sealed glass vials, a dozen of them, cushioned in black cloth, each one containing a liquid that was deep amber in color, almost the exact hue of the golden candles themselves. Labels of aged parchment were tied to each vial with red thread, covered in writing Thomas could not read, in a script he did not recognize. "Don't touch them," said Lord Blackwood sharply, and Thomas, who had been leaning forward with interest, jerked back. The Lord dismounted and crouched beside the box, examining the vials without touching them, his jaw tight. The 2 thieves were being held by Constable Warren. The taller one had gone sullen and silent. The shorter one, a wiry man with frightened eyes, had begun to talk immediately and couldn't seem to stop. Didn't know what they were, only that a man in London paid us to get them from the candlemaker and bring them to the river landing. Paid in advance. I swear it, we weren't told. "Who paid you?" demanded Constable Warren. The wiry man hesitated. Then, he gave no name. A man with a yellow coat and a brand on his left hand, burned in like a letter. I couldn't read it. Lord Blackwood rose slowly from beside the box. He looked at Thomas, who was still standing there looking at the vials with enormous curiosity, and something in his expression shifted. Not quite a smile, but the suggestion that a smile was somewhere in the vicinity. "You made a great deal of noise," Lord Blackwood said. "I fell into a pile of timber, my lord," Thomas said honestly. "It was an accident." "The best kind," said the lord. He picked up the walnut box carefully and handed it to his manservant, who had arrived on foot behind them. "The constable will take these men for questioning. I need to speak with the boy." Chapter 15. The Truth About the Candles. They sat in the warming room of the mill owner having been persuaded to give them use of it with the authority that large stone houses and fur-lined cloaks tend to convey. And Lord Blackwood told Thomas the truth about the candles. "The wax," Lord Blackwood said, "is not ordinary wax. Master Aldrich was correct when he told you it came from an Italian monastery. But what he did not tell you, what even I did not fully appreciate until recently, is that the monks there have preserved a knowledge of medicinal preparations that goes back many centuries. The amber liquid in those vials is an extract, an ancient one. Combined with the wax, it produces a candle whose smoke, when burned, has been documented to have remarkable effects in sick rooms." Thomas looked at the box on the table between them. "It heals people?" "Not precisely," Lord Blackwood said carefully. "Nothing is quite that simple. What the monks found, over centuries of use in their own infirmary, is that the burning of these candles in a closed room appears to slow the spread of certain sicknesses, respiratory ones particularly. Whether it is the particular herbs in the extract, the quality of the wax, or something else entirely, the monks could not say. But their records go back 200 years, and the evidence, for those who know to look for it." He spread his hands. "It is significant." Thomas sat very still, absorbing this. "The plague," he said at last. Lord Blackwood looked at him. "You've heard." "Everyone has heard, my lord." "Yes." The lord was quiet for a moment. "The plague is coming. I do not know when. Perhaps it will spare Millhaven, perhaps not. But these candles, 12 of them, enough to burn in the church for the whole of Advent and Christmas, in a building where every soul in this town will gather to pray, or to be my offering. Not to God exactly, though I am not irreligious, but to the people of this town." He said the last sentence quietly, without performance, in a way that made Thomas believe it completely. "Someone in London knew about them," Thomas said, "and sent men to take them before they could be used." Lord Blackwood nodded. "There are people, merchants, certain powerful men, who have an interest in controlling things that are scarce and valuable. A preparation that appears to offer some protection against the plague would be worth a great fortune." His voice was flat and cold. "Worth more than the health of one small townspeople." Thomas thought about his mother, carrying laundry in the cold, his grandmother, her hands stiff with the winter, little Nell with her bright, clever face, the baker, the blacksmith, the cloth merchant, old Henry with his barley fields, all the people of Millhaven going about their lives, not knowing about amber vials and monastery monks and men in yellow coats. "Are they safe now?" he asked. "The vials? The candles? They are safe," Lord Blackwood said, "thanks in large part to a candlemaker's apprentice with observant eyes and fast legs, and a talent for falling into timber piles." This time the almost smile arrived completely. "What is your name, boy?" "Thomas Whitfield, my lord." "Of Tanner's Lane." "Thomas Whitfield." The lord said it as though filing it somewhere. "How long have you been apprenticed to Aldrich?" 6 months, my lord." "And before that?" "Nothing, my lord. My father is a soldier. My mother takes in laundry. I can read and write. My grandmother taught me." Lord Blackwood looked at him for a long moment. Then, "Go home, Thomas. See to it that Master Aldrich has someone to manage the shop while he recovers his head. I will arrange for the remaining work to be completed." Thomas stood, gave the best bow he could manage, and went to the door. "Thomas," said Lord Blackwood. He turned. "Your grandmother taught you to read and write. What else did she teach you?" Thomas thought about it honestly. "To notice things," he said at last. "She taught me to notice things." The Lord nodded slowly, as if Thomas had confirmed something. "A valuable education," he said, "more valuable than many people realize." Chapter 16. When the plague came. The plague did come to England, as old Henry had predicted. It arrived in the late spring of the following year, creeping up from the ports in the south, reaching inland towns and cities in a slow, terrible wave. It came to villages in the Midlands and the north. It came eventually to the edges of the country Thomas knew. But it did not come to Millhaven, or rather, it came to the edges, like dark water lapping at a door, and then retreated. Nobody could explain it with certainty. The priest said it was God's mercy. Dr. Reeves said it was likely some fortunate quality of the town's location, its clean river water, its distance from the trade roads. Lord Blackwood said nothing publicly, but Thomas, who had been paying attention since last October, noticed that the 12 golden candles burned at the altar of St. Mary's Church throughout Advent and Christmas and into January, filling that cold stone space with a warm, honey-sweet smoke every evening when the whole town gathered for prayers. Whether it was the candles, or the water, or God's mercy, or simple fortunate chance, Thomas could not know. But he kept the question turning over in his mind like a smooth stone worn round by a river. And that habit of keeping questions alive rather than demanding immediate answers would serve him well for the rest of his life. Master Aldrich recovered from his head wound within a week, though he complained about it for considerably longer than that. The stolen box was returned to its shelf, the brass clasp repaired, the lock newly oiled. 2 months later, the candlemaker told Thomas, in his short, oblique way, that Lord Blackwood had sent word of his appreciation. He said, "Master Aldrich reported, studying a candlewick with professional attention, that you showed both sense and courage." He used those exact words. Thomas waited. He had learned to wait. "He has offered," Master Aldrich continued, in the tone of a man choosing each word with care, "to fund your continued education. Reading, writing, mathematics, Latin, at the church school, under Father Gregory, starting after Easter." Thomas said nothing for a long moment. The warm tallow smell of the workshop surrounded him like a familiar coat. The fire crackled under the copper pot. Outside, the market square rang with the ordinary sounds of a Monday morning in early spring. The baker calling out, the blacksmith's hammer, children somewhere laughing. "Would I still work here?" he asked at last. "Mornings," Master Aldrich said, "and Saturdays. Someone has to keep this shop properly swept." Chapter 17. The season turns. Spring came to Millhaven with the particular extravagance it always brought to the English countryside after a hard winter. Bluebells along the river path, the elm tree outside the cottage bursting suddenly and almost violently into leaf, the smell of the plowed earth from old Henry's fields drifting down across the rooftops on a warm south wind. Thomas's life changed in ways both large and small. He began school at the church on Tuesday and Thursday mornings, sitting on a wooden bench in the side room with 5 other children of various ages, learning Latin declensions and multiplication tables and the proper way to write a formal letter, all taught by Father Gregory, a patient and unexpectedly funny man who had a habit of telling illustrative stories that began with the words, "There was once a monk who," and ended, invariably, with a lesson that stuck in the memory, better than any simple instruction. He still worked in the workshop every morning from 6 until noon, and all day on Saturdays. He was, by this point, fully trusted with the beeswax. Master Aldrich had begun to let him make small practice pieces in the special wax, under close supervision. The candle maker never said so directly, but Thomas understood that this was a significant thing. Beeswax was Master Aldrich's territory, the innermost chamber of his craft, and he shared it only with someone he had decided was worth sharing it with. Grandmother Maud was delighted about the school. She sat at the fire each evening and quizzed Thomas on what he had learned, shaking her head with pleasure at the Latin words and asking him to write things down for her on the back of an old cloth scrap so she could look at the shapes of the letters. She had never had the chance to learn herself. She treated his new knowledge the way she treated his stub candles, not with envy, but with a kind of generous satisfaction, as though his having it was as good as her having it herself. Nell was not going to be outdone. Within 6 months of Thomas beginning school, she had persuaded Father Gregory, through a combination of obvious intelligence and absolute relentlessness, to admit her to the class as well, despite the fact that she was the youngest there by 3 years, and, as Father Gregory later admitted to Thomas, already ahead of most of the others. "Your sister," Father Gregory told Thomas one morning, "is either going to become very learned or very troublesome, and it is my experience that the two things often go together." Thomas grinned his gap-toothed grin. "Both, I'd say, Father." Chapter 18. The Letter. It was in the midsummer of that year, the year the plague had skirted Millhaven and moved on, the year Thomas turned 11, that the letter arrived. It came from London, written in a formal hand on good parchment, addressed to Lord Edmund Blackwood of Millhaven. Thomas had nothing to do with it, and should not have known about it at all. But the manner in which Lord Blackwood, 2 weeks after its arrival, summoned Thomas to the manor house, alone this time, without Master Aldrich, meant that its contents were about to become relevant to him in a very direct way. He walked up the hill again on a warm July morning, watching the butterflies in the meadow grass and thinking about the wick-braiding technique he had been attempting to master all week. The manor house, in full summer, looked entirely different from the cold October Sunday of his first visit. The gray stone was warm in the sunlight, and someone had planted climbing roses along the south wall, their blooms the exact red of Master Aldrich's face on a hot afternoon at the wax vats. The manservant showed him to the same room as before. Lord Blackwood was there, standing at the window, looking out over his rolling summer fields with his hands clasped behind his back. He turned when Thomas entered. "Thomas, sit down." Thomas sat. He noticed immediately that there was a letter on the table, folded with a broken seal. He noticed also that Lord Blackwood looked simultaneously pleased and thoughtful in a way that suggested he had been turning the decision over carefully and had arrived at a conclusion. "The man in the yellow coat," Lord Blackwood said without preamble, "has been identified and brought to account. The Constable of London, an efficient man, it turns out, traced him through the wiry fellow we arrested at the river. He was a merchant from Bristol with some very questionable connections to the plague trade, if I can call it that. People who profit from sickness." His voice was cool and precise. "He will not be troubling anyone further." "I'm glad," said Thomas. "Thought you would be." Lord Blackwood sat down across from him. "The monastery in Italy, which supplied the wax and the extract, has sent a letter of thanks." They had feared their particular knowledge was in danger of being stolen and exploited, as it has been in the past. They were gratified that Millhaven proved inhospitable to such ambitions. A pause. They also inquired, through certain channels, about the circumstances of the recovery. They were told there was a boy, a candlemaker's apprentice. Thomas sat very still. They have offered, said Lord Blackwood, to take an apprentice of their own. A student who shows both practical skill and, let me find their exact words. He glanced at the letter. An aptitude for observation, a capacity for patience, and an understanding that knowledge exists to serve people rather than to profit from them. He set down the letter. I put your name forward, Thomas, with Master Aldrich's agreement. Thomas looked at the table for a long moment. Italy was a word he had encountered in Father Gregory's lessons. It was a country in the south of Europe, across the sea, full of cities with marble columns and scholars who had preserved the learning of the ancient world through centuries of chaos. It was very far from Tanner's Lane. Italy, he said carefully. Not immediately, Lord Blackwood said, with the ghost of that smile. You are 11. The offer stands for when you are ready. The monks are patient people. When you have completed your education here, when Master Aldrich determines you are fully competent in the craft, when you yourself feel prepared, then the door is open. He looked at Thomas steadily. The decision is yours. It would have to be. Thomas thought about his mother, his grandmother, Nell with her relentless cleverness, the cottage on Tanner's Lane with the elm tree outside. Could I think about it? He asked. You have several years in which to think about it, Lord Blackwood said. Take them. Chapter 19. The Art of Making Light. Time passed in Millhaven, as time passes in small towns, in the rhythm of seasons, in the gradual change of ordinary things. The plague, by God's grace, or the monk's wisdom, or clean water, or simple good fortune, did not return. The fields were planted and harvested. The market went on. The blacksmith's hammer rang through the mornings. The baker's bread scented the square at sunrise. Thomas grew. Not tall. He was always going to be a compact, precise sort of person, but outward, in the way that children grow when they are given nourishment of the right kinds. He learned Latin well enough to read the monks' parchments on the subjects of natural philosophy and medicine. He learned mathematics well enough to understand the proportions of wax compounds. He became, over the course of 2 more years, a genuinely skilled candlemaker, not yet a master, but someone whose candles burned straight and even and true, whose wicks were wound with the perfect tension that made the difference between a flame that guttered and one that held steady in a draught. Master Aldrich taught him slowly, and without obvious affection, which was, Thomas had come to understand, the candlemaker's particular form of affection. The day Master Aldrich let Thomas make a complete set of beeswax candles alone, from measuring the wax to the final polish, without any supervision, and then examined them in silence for a long minute and said, "They'll do." Thomas understood that this was Master Aldrich's equivalent of a celebration. He wrote everything down. He kept a journal now. Lord Blackwood had given him a proper small book with stitched pages, not just scraps of cloth with charcoal marks, and he filled it with observations. The exact temperature at which different waxes behaved differently, the way the quality of tallow varied depending on the season the cattle were slaughtered, the curious fact that candles made on humid days burned slightly differently than candles made in dry weather. He wrote down the things he noticed in the town as well. The social things, the human things. A record of Millhaven's ordinary life, year by year, in a boy's increasingly confident handwriting. He wrote about his grandmother, who was beginning to slow, who sat more often by the fire and less often at the washtub, who still quizzed him in Latin in the evenings, though sometimes she fell asleep in the middle of a declension. He wrote about Nell, who was becoming formidable. Father Gregory had begun to speak of her as the finest student he had taught in 20 years of teaching, which embarrassed Nell not at all, and which had prompted several conversations with Lord Blackwood about the possibility of further education for girls, conversations that Thomas suspected would bear fruit eventually, because Lord Blackwood was not a man who had conversations he did not intend to act upon. He wrote about his mother, who had stopped taking in other people's laundry because Lord Blackwood had hired her to manage the linen supply for the manor house, a proper job with proper pay that let her stop before dark and eat a full supper. He wrote about Master Aldrich, whose red face had grown redder with the years, and whose gray beard had grown grayer, and who one autumn afternoon, this was 2 years after the candle episode, told Thomas, in his indirect way, that when he himself was too old to manage the shop, he intended to leave it to someone with sense enough to run it, and that he did not currently know of any other candidates.